Kōrero no whānau. Thank you very much for coming again. Kia ora. E me ngā mihi ki te kopapa o te wā, toia tu te marae o tāne, toia tu te marae o Tangaroa, toia tu te iwi. When the land and sea are strong, so are the. Kia ora. Karakia tīmatanga. Tutua wai mai I runga, tutua mai I raro, tutua mai I roto, tutua mai I waho. Kai tau ai te mauri tu, te mauri ora ki te katoa. Homi e huye, tāhi e. Kia ora.
Good morning, everybody. Just in case I'm forgetting, once we have heard from the listeners today, we're going to take this rules. I just want to have a little discussion about the offline site visit, and perhaps even we don't know if we have a chance to think about that. So we're just interested in your views about potentially the value of that and what your sort of perception of that is. We kind of discussed it last night and sort of came to a preliminary review, which I'm not going to share with you. But overnight, I've actually reflected a bit more and thought that actually my perceptions of Fiordland are now over 2 years old. And when you're trying to understand people's feelings about what changes have occurred sort of under the planning framework over time, then there could be some value in that. And there's something I haven't explored with the panel last night about sort of how recent or old our sort of perceptions of, particularly of doubtful therapy, and obviously dusky is what's been offered. So we're just going to keep our views sort of still unformed, but I'd be very interested for those of you, and you might need the opportunity just to chat about that as well before we come back to us. And it doesn't necessarily need to be today that we make a decision, but I just wanted to bring that up this morning so that we can circle back around and when we come back to you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. I see we have the Fiordland Marine Guardians there, and we've got Dr. McLeod, welcome, and Mr. Pache. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Dr. McLeod, I assume you're going to start off. We don't have any written things tabled, so you're just going to be speaking to us this morning, is that correct?
Yes, thank you. And I'm not sure if you've got any set ideas about timing, but I just need to let you know I need to be gone by about 10:30 at the latest. Hope that is okay with you.
No, that's fine. I don't think, given the scope of your submission, I don't think we'll be particularly long this morning, so I think that should be fine.
Okay. Would you like me to begin?
Yes, over to you.
Fantastic. Tēnā koutou, and thank you very much for hearing our submission this morning. Mark and myself are here to represent the Fiordland Marine Guardians. There are 8 Fiordland Marine Guardians, and we're all appointed by the Minister for the Environment. We each have a long history with the Fiordland Marine area and a wide range of relevant local experience, knowledge and expertise. Whilst individually we're not representatives of any particular sector or interest group, collectively we have a balanced mix of knowledge and experience in relation to the Fiordland Marine area. So we'd like to begin by introducing ourselves and describing our individual histories with the Fiordland Marine area. And we regard this as important context because the motivation for this plan change, which are concerns about the carrying capacity of the Fiordland Marine area for vessels and visitors, are currently founded on perception and on qualitative information. So hopefully by learning a bit more about us, it will give you some greater confidence in our viewpoint. So I'll just hand over to Mark to introduce himself first, please.
Thank you, Rebecca. Because I've got the most amount of grey hair, I get to go first. So as you can tell by the grey hair, I first went to Fiordland in 1976. I was on a fishing vessel. So I commercially fished from 1976 for 28 years, mainly in the northern part of Fiordland. Most of the work I did was from Doubtful Sound north. So just a bit of context around when I got to Milford Sound in 76, and the largest tourist vessel then was the 15.8 metre Friendship, which was owned by Fiordland Travel at the time. So, you know, now we've got, you know, vessels there of 40 metres in length. So, I mean, it just gives you some scale how much things have changed. But so after 28 years of rock lobster fishing, mainly in Fiordland, I retired, and because of our health issues, I'm back. And I did some relieving work for the first sort of 18 months for Lance and Ruth Shaw. I was relieving skipper on the Breaksea Girl. Was predominantly doing 3-day trips in Doubtful, sort of Thompson Complex, as well as trips down to the Southern Fjords, Dusky and Preservation. After that, I then was a relieving skipper. I skippered the Southern Winsford dock, did 5 to 6 years, I can't remember, it was for them anyway. And all of that work was based south of Doubtful Sound. So a lot of it was in the Breaksea Dusky complex, mainly around Dusky, but also did quite a bit of work in Preservation and Chalky. So for the experience there, I guess I had a good range right throughout Fiordland, from, you know, where the surface water consents start from Yates's Point down to Pusica Point. Also, I've been involved with the, I was a trustee of for 4 or 5 years, the Fiordland Conservation Trust, and I'm currently a trustee of the Southern Coastal Charitable Trust that manages the cleanups, coastal cleanups in Fiordland and Stewart Island. So that's yeah, a wee bit of what I've done.
Thanks. And yeah, I'm Rebecca McLeod, and I first visited the Fiordland Marine area as a postgraduate student in 2002. And I was really fortunate to participate in DOC's biological monitoring trips, where we jumped on the boat, and back in the days of the old Renown, we jumped on the boat in Bluff and made our way all the way up to Milford and dived right throughout the Fiordland Marine area. So we were scuba diving and making scientific measurements and observations from right in the depths of the fjords right to the open coast environment all the way up. I then went on to do my doctoral thesis on Fiordland's marine ecology, and I followed that up with some postdoctoral research in the area as well. So I've been a Fiordland Marine Guardian since 2012, and I've had the privilege of chairing the group since 2015, and I continue to do research in Fiordland. I'm currently involved in a science program that is looking at the natural ability of the Fiordland marine environment to sequester carbon, so sort of looking at natural climate change solutions in there. And really, when it comes to the scientific research, the more we look, the more we find, and the more special and important this place becomes, not just in a national context, but globally. Hence the special protection measures that are in place. So about the Fiordland Marine Guardians, we were established under the Fiordland Te Moana o Ātawhenua Marine Management Act in 2005. And at our first meeting, this vision was adopted, that the quality of Fiordland's marine environment and fisheries, including the wider fishery experience, be maintained or improved for future generations to use and enjoy. And this vision is shared with Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu and our management agency partners, who are Environment Southland, Ministry for Primary Industries, the Ministry for the Environment, and the Department of Conservation. And this vision is more than just about fisheries. It talks about the wider fishery experience, which we interpret as being those values that you experience when you're on the water, immersed in Fiordland, and you can feel that solitude and wilderness, and yeah, the quiet of the place, and the natural wonder. So that vision still guides us very much today. We refer to it at pretty much every meeting we have, to keep us grounded and keep us on track with our work. Part of our statutory role is that the Guardians identify risks to the Fiordland Marine area, and that we promote and facilitate integrated management. We assess the effects of management measures, and we advise the agencies on matters including compliance, monitoring, and biosecurity. The Guardians, we're very grateful that following the delegation we made to the Council in February 2021, you've acted on the concerns that we raised by initiating this plan change. The objective of the plan change is to hold the line on the current consented surface water activities in the Fiordland Marine area. And we're pleased with that. We're concerned with the extent to which the status quo established in this Plan Change 5 will be used as the new baseline when the full regional coastal plan review takes place. Generally, we're pleased with and supportive of the content and the direction shown of the proposed plan change, but we do wish to make the following comments and suggestions. And here we're basically running through an order of that was followed in this 42 hearing report. I hope you can keep up. So we'll begin with objective 16.1.1, and Mark, feel free to jump in here if there's anything you'd like to add. So this is the objective to maintain essential characteristics. The Guardians are seeking that to support our submission, the wording of the objective be changed to restore essential characteristics. We regard that many of these characteristics have already been degraded. By focusing on restoration, it would send a clear aspirational message that a declining state is not acceptable and the current level of activity should not represent the permitted baseline. This aligns with policy 14 of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement that promotes the restoration or rehabilitation of the natural character of the coastal environment. And we'll expand on this further in point 4 and 4.9 of our submission. So on to 3.4, which is the wilderness and remoteness values of the Fiordland Waters report, or the Booth report. A quote from that report: it has acknowledged visitor perceptions and experiences are key considerations that require consideration in the development of a long-term carrying capacity framework for the Fiordland coastal area. The visitor perceptions in this report must be considered in context. In this case, they were portrayed to the author from charter vessel operators, i.e. they were second-hand accounts from visitors who were likely mostly getting their first experience of Fiordland. And we appreciate that assessing visitor perceptions will be a key component of the full coastal plan review. There are many kinds of visitors to Fiordland. In fact, given that there is not a resident population, pretty much everyone can be considered visitors, whether they are tourists, recreational users, or commercial operators, be they in the fishing or tourism sectors. An informed judgment on perception as it relates to carrying capacity should consider a wide range of visitors, and their history of visiting Fiordland should be a key factor that is controlled for. Any interviews should represent all types of visitors and assesses their feedback based on the length of time that they have frequented the area. In terms of the scope of the report, here I'm referring to 3.9. We're very supportive of the statement in the S42 report that the lack of management within the RCP for cumulative effects of surface water consents has the potential to result in granting of resource consent applications that collectively adversely affect the significant values present. Based on policy 3 of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, we consider it's appropriate to adopt a precautionary approach to the management of surface water activities within the Fiordland coastal area. So that was a quote there. And we ask if the commissioners have confidence that this will cement the baseline. If it was this lack of ability to consider these cumulative effects of new surface water consents that led the Guardians to request for the Plan Change 5 to be initiated. The Guardians requested that this to be actioned so that a pause in the issuing of further consents, together with holding the current surface water consents within their current prescribed conditions, could occur until the required assessment into the carrying capacity of the Fiordland Marine area has been satisfactorily assessed when the full review of the coastal plan takes place. Onto section 4, the submissions and analysis with recommendations. 4.2.9, the analysis. We disagree with the officer's report that the findings of the wilderness and remoteness values of Fiordland Waters report identifies that some participants did not consider the values had been adversely affected. We think this is because of the relatively small sample size of participants in the survey, and that the majority of those interviewed were surface water activity consent holders or first-time visitors to the Fiordland Marine area. For example, we note that the recent massive increase in effort in what was the remote Tamatea Dusky Sound Complex has resulted in the degradation of its significant wilderness and remoteness values in a relatively short space of time. We're concerned that the current state will default to being the cemented baseline rather than it being determined as part of the coastal plan review. This should be when the appropriate baseline is determined, and acknowledging that this may be based on a time in the past when activity levels were lower than they are today. Policy 16.2.2, avoid adverse effects on internationally, nationally, and regionally significant values. So paragraph 4.50, we disagree with Real Journeys Limited submission that in some instances, vessel upgrades may result in larger vessels due to the need for more space for wastewater treatment facilities or carbon reduction measures. We support the officer's analysis of the risks associated with this proposal. There is no case to be made for increasing vessel size under this plan change. For example, the proposal to extend by 10% in length their entire vessel fleet. And noting here that vessel size is not just about length, it encompasses its total bulk being not only the length, but the height, the width, and the gross tonnage. Paragraph 4.53, we disagree that Real Journeys Limited submission that this policy is problematic for other surface water activities such as pest control work, as we're concerned that could result in the guise of pest control being used to gain access to restricted areas. And we're happy to provide examples of already witnessing that in the Fiordland Marine area if you wish. Further, they are requesting that clause 2 is amended from the effects threshold in the proposed policy of not granting consents where effects will increase to not granting consents where effects will be more than minor. For the Guardians, Plan Change 5 is about holding the line. We disagree with this request as it could allow too much uncertainty within the policy. We agree with the concern of the submitter that the proposed policy will result in the displacement of coastal surface water activity to other parts of the coastal marine area, for example, to Rakiura Stewart Island, and we're already witnessing this. But the answer to that is to increase the protective measures for Rakiura Stewart Island rather than to diminish the protection for the Fiordland Marine area. Analysis, paragraph 4.56. We agree with the officer that increased vessel size can also impact on landscape and natural character values. 4.57, we disagree that increases in vessel size should be able to be considered on a case-by-case basis through the resource consent process under this plan change. Even with this considered as a non-complying activity, we think it would result in a retrograde step where the potential adverse effects are considered in isolation with no regard being given to the cumulative effects of these changes. This is already considered an issue with the current coastal plan and is a key motivation for initiating this plan change. We're very concerned about the recent example of Real NZ swapping out an existing vessel in Patea Doubtful Sound with another that was substantially larger in size. In this matter, the Commissioner considered the effects of this were no more than minor. It's unacceptable that this could result in all vessels theoretically doubling or tripling their size, with the effects of this change being considered as no more than minor or less than minor, due to any potential adverse effects being considered in an individual, non-cumulative context. I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, Mark, or shall I keep going?
I think we should talk about this later on if we can, please.
Okay, excellent. Paragraph 4.58, allowing an applicant to have a case-by-case basis assessment on whether the adverse effects of increasing vessel size are less than minor would undermine the whole purpose of this plan change. In its current form, this paragraph is a wide open door for increases in vessel size. 4.59, to support our comments made earlier, the last sentence of paragraph 4.59 should be amended to include as well as increases in vessel tonnage. Paragraph 4.62. For clarity, we are requesting the addition of the following wording: recognising the values of the Fiordland Marine Area in 2005 in regard to this legislation, because we believe the significant values of the Fiordland Marine Area should include having its own act and the guardians who manage it. And I believe that was questioned in the S42 report, hence that clarification there. Paragraph 4.64. We agree with the statement that Fiordland is generally free of habitation. However, we note that Kisby Lodge is located on private land, and also that this is not operated as a commercial tourist lodge. We consider that there is no place for private or commercial accommodation in the coastal marine area or the national park outside of Deep Cove and Milford Sound Puapia Tahi. Paragraph 4.68. We support the officer's comments that avoid is retained rather than being replaced by manage, as this gives effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Paragraph 4.69. We support the officer's comments as it is important to avoid rather than manage, and this also gives effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Moving on to policy 16.2.3, avoid or mitigate the adverse effects on marine mammals. Paragraph 4.77, we oppose the submission of Real Journeys Limited, as there is a well-established body of scientific knowledge that clearly demonstrates the link between increasing vessel disturbance on a marine mammal body condition, fecundity, and calf survivability and mortality. Policy 16.2.4, restrictions on commercial day trips in Patea Doubtful Sound. Paragraph 4.95, we agree with the officer that there is sufficient scope within policies 16.2.8 and 16.2.13 to enable the consideration of helicopter transfers and their associated effects. Policy 16.2.7, remote and wilderness values in the fjords, inlets and arms. We again need to reiterate that we do not accept that the Dusky Breaksea complex should be managed in the future on the basis that the current usage be accepted as the default baseline. Policy 16.2.8, impacts on wilderness and remoteness values. In the analysis, the officer states that helicopter landing and takeoffs are captured in clause 5 of policy 16.2.8. There is a risk of potential adverse effects on wilderness and remoteness values from fly-in, fly-out short trips, and we seek assurance from the panel that they are confident this plan change will prevent this from occurring. 4.135, we suggest for clarity that officers' proposed amendment to clause 4 should include the following: cumulative effects including increasing numbers of ships and structures such as barges and concentrations of these vessels. Policy 16.2.10, monitoring of surface water activities and their effects. Paragraph 4.167, we disagree in part with the officer's analysis of this policy. We maintain that the explanation to the policy should be amended from should to will obtain baseline information. If it cannot be defined that this will happen, then it is probable that there is insufficient data to gauge if this policy can be given effect to. Monitoring of this and any other policy is a requirement and not an option. We're aware that monitoring of the current coastal plan has not been effective. Adequate funding from Council to give effect to this plan change is a given for the Council. Policy 16.2.12, research ships. We support the officer's analysis and recommendations in this section. Policy 16.2.15, consent term. As the use of and pressure on the Fiordland Marine Area is forever changing, shorter consent terms allow for a more responsive and adaptive management approach. We recognise this is not within the scope of PC5 and it should instead be dealt with under the full Regional Coastal Plan Review. Rule 16.2.1, commercial surface water activities. Under the analysis, paragraph 4.225, we support the officer's recommendation, which is in support of Te Ao Marama Incorporated and Te Rūnanga o Ngāi Tahu's submission, that the new clause 3, as suggested by RJ's Limited, is not included in this rule. And we therefore support the recommendation that there is a risk that including surface water activities, i.e. when undertaking pest control or mooring inspections, through adding a new clause, could potentially be used for unintended activities and therefore result in an increase in activity and adverse effects, which could be inconsistent with the objectives and policies of PC5 and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So to conclude, whilst it's not part of this plan change, we advocate that the wider Regional Coastal Plan Review assessment of the carrying capacity of the Fiordland Marine Area should be assessed at a sub-area or sub-regional basis, and it should also have regard to safety. And by safety, we're referring to the ability for all vessels in the area to be able to find safe haven during adverse weather and sea events. We also believe it would be of value to submitters and the hearing panel if staff could indicate the expected timeframe of the full coastal plan review so that there are adequate policies and rules in PC5 to ensure it can effectively enable the vision of the Guardians to be fulfilled. We therefore advocate that in order to achieve our statutory vision during this transitional period, Council should take a precautionary approach as outlined in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement 3, with any new and/or variations to surface water activity resource consents. The Guardians encourage the hearing panel to focus on the importance of ensuring that PC5 encompasses the required robust policies and rules in order to hold the line on surface water activities in the FMA, as we anticipate it will be some time before the full review of the Regional Coastal Plan becomes operative. When encouraging Council to make this plan change, our intent was to halt any further expansion of surface water activities in the Fiordland Marine Area until such time as the carrying capacity could be fully assessed. Whilst we appreciate the direction PC5 takes with respect to not issuing any new surface water consents, we are concerned that PC5 doesn't go far enough to prevent increases in vessel size. Our interpretation of PC5 is that although classed as a non-complying activity, consent holders will still be able to apply for amendments to consents to increase the size of their vessels. In practicality, that would likely result in the application for an individual vessel to be increased under consent, to be assessed in isolation in terms of its effects on natural character values. They would no doubt call upon an expert who would conclude that the effects of that increase in size of that one vessel was no more than minor. The office has done a thorough analysis of the cumulative results of all vessels increasing in size, but this wouldn't really be taken into account in the context of one operator applying for a variation to a resource consent. We'd find comfort if somebody could assure us that the draft plan actually removes any wriggle room or scope for increasing vessel sizes in the Fiordland Marine Area until the full coastal plan review is completed. So thank you. I hope you find that helpful, and we're happy to answer any questions. I guess, Mark, would you like to expand on anything I've said now or wait for questions?
I think that I'd like to expand or explain why we're so insistent on holding the line. Would it be all right if I gave the example of the hearing we were in with the Milford Wanderer, the swap out with that, and the Milford Mariner? Would that be of interest to the panel?
Yes, certainly. So
thank you, Commissioner. But we were really disturbed about how we could have a vessel. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but effectively they're the overnight vessels this is no slight on the company. This is an example of why we want to hold the current surface water activity within what they're granted for currently. So what we had there was the company wanted to change their smaller vessel, which is the Milford Wanderer, which is 27.5 metres in length, and I'll agree that they were allowed to, and their consent was allowed, that was up to a 30-metre vessel that could operate under that consent. But what they did was they wanted to change that for the larger Milford Wanderer. So this went from a 27.5 metre vessel to a 36.6 metre vessel. So just wanted to say as well, there's another part to this. This is registered length. That is not the overall length of the vessel. So over and above that length is the bowsprit, and that's actually what's above waterline. So these are effectively a 40-metre vessel. But it wasn't just the length. The beam of the vessels from the Milford Wanderer was 8.4. The Milford Mariner was 10 metres. But, here's the telling story, was that this is, why it's not just about length, it's about bulk. So this, the larger vessel has got another story on it. But the gross tonnage really gives you an idea of how much bigger these vessels are. So it went from 258 tonne gross tonnage for the Milford Wanderer to the Milford Mariner, which was 693. So this is a substantially larger vessel. But, what happened with that hearing was that the commissioner found that, the effects were no more than minor. So, we really struggled with that. And I did, because I know both the vessels, I've been around them a reasonable amount. But, what this did was effectively the new vessel was about, 33% larger than the one it was replacing. And whilst when they're in the arm of Doubtful, for instance, if you're looking at these vessels 2-3 miles away, the landscape has the ability in certain circumstances to lessen the effect of those vessels. But personally, my issue was with this is that when these vessels come into the anchorages or into Blanket Bay, where they let their hot kayaks go and their clients are on them, that's where you see the size of these vessels and the impacts they have in those confined areas. So it's not, whilst on the open arms, these aren't as big as what they appear, but close up when they're in confined anchorages and confined spaces, that's where these what were deemed to be minor changes become more than minor. The effects in confined anchorages, that's where it's very noticeable. So that's why we are intent on that all surface water consents should be held within their current constraints that they are, and then what they are issued at.
Anything else, Mr. Peugeot?
Just I think what we really didn't expand on, but I think one of the things that we haven't done well, and this is no fault of anyone's, but other than the constraints around Doubtful Sound, where vessels can operate in backcountry, etc., the rest of the surface water consents are issued from Yates's Point, which is the north side of Milford Sound, to Puska Point in the south. So there are no constraints upon surface water consent operators all being, accumulating in one particular area. If your consent was, constrained for X amount of your time being able to use in a certain part of fuel and part of it in another, there's some control over how all of these vessels are in one place, and the effects, the cumulative effects, when they come together, which we've seen in the last few years, and especially in the Dusky area. So, a lot of that was brought about by COVID, but it doesn't change anything. But what, we have under the current consent in the process is that, they can move about throughout the Fiordland as they're allowed to do, but it doesn't allow for the, to manage the effects as they are in the different areas of Fiordland. I didn't say that very well, but I hope you get the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess just a little bit of further context in a similar vein is around the latent effort that exists in the consents that are currently in action. So what we're seeing on the water at the moment is only a fraction of the amount of activity that could legally take place if all of the consents were actioned. We're aware of consents that don't currently have vessels operating under them, for example, or consents where there are vessels only operating for a small part of the year, or for a fraction of the trips that they have consent to operate. So when we're talking about the sort of status quo, there's what you observe on the water, but then there's also what's actually currently permitted under the existing suite of consents for the Fiordland Marine area. And that's something that we've been working with council to try and get a bit more visibility on in terms of the risk of managing these effects, not just spatially, but also in time, when there's so much sort of scope within the full suite of consents that are out there for the Fiordland Marine area, but very little ability to manage the activities on a finer scale in time or in space throughout the Fiordland Marine area.
So Rebecca, I think a good example of that is we've recently seen with a surface water consent in Dusky Sound that wasn't utilising part of their allocation, and with there's a new 15.6 metre vessel just turned up there. This is this latent effect that's whilst what we see on the water is what's actually operating. There's all this latent effort that hasn't been used, and here was another vessel turned up that was it's been consented for some time, but it hasn't been used.
Okay, and I believe that's the end, unless you have any questions for us or points you'd like us to elaborate on.
We do have questions. Thank you very much.
I feel like we went through that at a cracking pace. I don't know if you managed to keep up.
You actually got faster like a racehorse, but you can see the inline. But I didn't want to interrupt you and slow you down, so that's okay. But what I will ask you both is if you can provide a copy of the notes that you've obviously read off there and the points that you've spoken to. If you could provide those through Ms. Onko, that would be appreciated, so that we're not relying on our scrawling of what you've said.
No problem.
So thank you very much to you both, and I'm just going to kick off with a few questions here and a few things just to bring you up to date, because I'm not sure if you were online yesterday. I know that these are big roles that you've got, and you've got other jobs and lives outside of your role as the Guardians. So yesterday there were some documents tabled by Ms. Robertson in terms of the consent database and the consents that are held, and there's been a few corrections maybe and a few clarifications through that table, and some of that was in response to Ms. Black's evidence, where there was, I think, paragraph 15 had some bullet points there that didn't seem to be right in terms of the council's records, and that really goes to the heart of some of these consents that aren't being exercised, and some where there seems to be two consents held and things. So there is some new documents that were tabled yesterday that I just wanted to draw your attention to. In terms of the timing of the review, and I just want to let you know all this so that when you answer questions, you've got this in the back of your mind as well. The timing of the review, we were told by Ms. Robertson yesterday that the latest target for the council is to have a notified version of the plan by the end of 2024. So that's the intention at this time. So just bearing that all in mind, I've got a couple of questions. The first one relates to objective 16.1.1 and your suggestions there to change that to restore. I just wondered whether or not the wording along the lines of to maintain and where degraded restore would meet your concerns there, so that we would have both.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be an improvement. What do you think about that, Mark? You're searching for the paragraph, aren't you? It's right
Yeah,
in
I'm
front of you
sorry,
guys.
yeah, I've really struggled with this because there's so many documents I've got open and, so which policy was it? Sorry?
This was this.
Objective
Sorry.
16.1.1.
Right at the beginning of our submission, Mark, about maintaining or restoring essential characteristics.
I think your submission
Okay.
reads that you would take maintain out and put restore in, but I'm suggesting that perhaps it could be maintain and where degraded, restore.
You're happy with that?
The section 42A report talks about giving effect to the NZCPS, and we talked about that with Ms. Robertson yesterday, and she agreed that it probably, the way it's worded is a little bit strong, that in fact any reference to gives effect to NZCPS is probably more correct if it was this as a step towards giving effect to it through the wider review. I just wondered if that you would agree with that in terms of our finding. I think it's going to be difficult for us to say that it gives effect to the NZCPS when it's an interim measure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, with your interpretation there, and the alternative wording.
One thing that we raised yesterday with Ms. Robertson was a question about whether the council going forward was doing 2 assessments of values, in particular landscape and natural character, that would be one with the existing activities that are consented in them, but then also one assessment without those consented activities and acknowledgement that the courts say those are temporary parts of the existing environment. And that kind of gets to the heart of your baseline concerns. The council probably hasn't looked at it that way, and I think confirmed yesterday, well, they're going to come back to us on what that Ms. Robertson thought the assessment that's being undertaken, I think by Mr. Beatley, is probably just of the existing environment with those elements in it. So I'm interested in your view on, it obviously doesn't cut to the heart of this, but it certainly cuts to the heart of the review and perhaps some recommendations that we can make through this recommendation to council. I was going to say decision, but recommendation to council, and whether you've got a view on what's required in terms of assessing kind of that baseline when the 2 assessments are required.
Yeah, I like that idea. Of these 2 assessments, because we've been discussing as a group, we do set the baseline. That's a really complicated question, and particularly when it's based on, it's muddied by the perception of what's already there. It's very hard to assess kind of a clean slate when it's when you're taking into account all the existing activities. I'm thinking here of the Cascade Cove matter and how the sort of existing environment was assessed by the council, and then sort of they described sort of adding all these just a few more little bits on top, and that's no more than minor because the existing environment already includes all of this activity, and it just feels like if that's the only way you're looking at things, it's potentially can kind of go down that death by 1,000 cuts pathway. So I'd be really interested in an assessment of the baseline with none of those consents in there, or two assessments as you suggest, Commissioner. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, look, this is it's about perception. I mean, everyone will have a different perceptional baseline, if you like. I think, what I was trying to explain before, because by fjord, we can't control the service water consents or where they operate. So that creates a real issue. I mean, just I gave the example there recently to the Guardians where in 1977, the first time I went to Dusky Sound, it was in February. And that was in a period of weather. We were there for 10 days and it was flat calm. You couldn't have blown a match out. And in those 10 days, we never saw another vessel. I mean, that's how much Fiordland's changed. I mean, I know it was a long time ago, but, we would never, there was no commercial vessels, there's no one else. And, even though we had a large, at 6 months of the year, there was a commercial fleet that was operating, catching lobster. Effectively, for 6 months of the year, they weren't in Fiordland. So it's going to take some. I think I agree with what's being proposed, but I'm glad I'm not going to have that job because it's going to be hard for everyone to collectively agree what is acceptable. And I think, maybe back to where I started ranting was, maybe it needs to be, we need to look at, within fjords and especially areas that have a lot of pressure, what is acceptable there. Maybe there's parts of the year that, there's less effort goes into it, but rather than just saying across the board, this is what it will be. It might be better by area, by time.
Yeah, and I guess I'd add to that we have been thinking about different metrics that we could be monitoring as a group just to kind of assess how we're doing in terms of our vision for the area. And when it comes to natural character effects and landscape values, we were wondering whether it would be an interesting metric to survey regular users of the Fiordland Marine area about things like last night when you were on anchor and wherever, how many other vessels were also using that anchorage at the same time? And during the course of your activity today, how many other vessels did you sight? Or while you were during your trip, how many times did you witness an overhead helicopter movement? Metrics like that, which are quantitative, we should be able to come to some kind of agreement around what constitutes isolation or wilderness or whatever these experiences are that we're putting value on in the Fiordland Marine area, and come up with some kind of quantitative measure that we can then tune the carrying capacity to, whilst also taking into account safety. And I appreciate that that's not sort of a relevant assessment factor for under the Resource Management Act, but it's a serious concern of ours that there is within Fiordland there actually is only the ability to hold safely so many vessels at one time, particularly as vessels get larger and take up more space in anchorages and on moorings. There's less ability for the Fiordland Marine area to safely hold those vessels. So we really think that needs to be part of the assessment too. I've probably gone a bit off track, but that's kind of what the sorts of conversations that we've been having around the table that might help you in some way, I hope.
No, thank you. We are interested in the monitoring and the metrics because it's very easy to do some of the things which really relate to protection of amenity value and sort of human values, but it appears to be extremely hard to measure anything in terms of effects on intrinsic values. You take the humans out of there, and the carrying capacity is really a human issue, affecting a human issue, isn't it? Not really about protection of the environment per se. And I don't know whether the Guardians have thought much about those more environmental or ecological effects and perhaps how those could be monitored.
We're very interested in this acoustic monitoring work that's being undertaken in the Fiordland Marine area at the moment. It's a collaboration between scientists from the University of Waikato and Otago, and they've got sort of passive acoustic monitors in place, and they can use those to monitor natural noises like that come from healthy reef communities or that come from marine mammals, for example, but they can also use them to monitor vessel noise. And potentially in time the impacts that vessel noise could be having on the underwater marine environment, because when we think about the environment in there, we think about the environment that humans experience, which is topside, But we also do, if we're thinking about intrinsic values, we do need to be thinking about the environmental values underwater. And there's a lot of potential in that monitoring, and they are working, keeping the council in the loop there. And we can see really close ties between that and this coastal plan review in terms of assessing those sorts of things in a way that's able to be deployed and data gathered remotely and fed back into the system to give a comprehensive picture. So,
yeah, I was just sharing with the panel actually that there's some really interesting data coming out of Picton and previously out of Littleton, where people were saying the dolphins weren't actually present, particularly in Picton, very often. And in fact, what the acoustic data was showing that they were there morning and night. They just didn't show themselves to anybody. That there was a regular circuit going on every day. So that kind of data is actually probably something that's very valuable going forward.
Yes, and I mean, we've also got to be thinking in the future about cruise ship activity and what's acceptable or appropriate there as well. And those effects certainly extend well under the water in terms of noise effects. So. But similarly, we don't think much about helicopter movements when we're talking about the coastal plan. We've never really, even though there's the ability for the coastal plan to regulate helicopters and helicopter landings, it's not something that's really been incorporated into consents so far. So that's definitely something that we've noticed increasing in terms of helicopter movements for transporting tourists into the more remote parts of Fiordland, and doesn't seem to be getting captured anywhere or taken into consideration. So we'd like it to be in the future.
And further to that, the complication with that is a lot of the new vessels now have helipads on them. So it's not like they're coming in to land on a barge or a statutory pad. These vessels are moving with that throughout the fjords. So, how do you assess? Well, you don't know where the boat's going to be for a start for that helicopter to fly in and out of. So how do you manage and assess those effects? It's a real challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'd add to that with a move from, at the moment, most operators tend to do these kind of multi-day trips into, when we're talking about Dusky Sound Tamatea, 3 to 5, 7 day trips. And the helicopter loadings obviously happen at the beginning and end of that trip. But we know that there's demand out there for shorter fly-in, fly-out trips. And before COVID, there was increasing interest coming from overseas about directly to operators to see whether they would be prepared to offer those shorter trips. And that would result in vessels not travelling as far in terms of from where the points of access to the vessels are. So having more sort of concentrated effects on the water, but also obviously a lot more helicopter movements and impacts in the airspace and on the values. So it's something that at the moment there's probably again that sort of latent effort sitting there, and the ability for flexibility within consents that won't manage that change in usage patterns in the future.
My first one was for Mark. Mark referred to the size of vessels being changed or increased, and the beam. And you mentioned the effects. Can you tell us what the effects are that you observe? You mentioned that ships would look larger under some circumstances. What effects are you observing if the current size of vessels or their length or their beam is increased?
Yeah, so it's I guess that there's it's everyone likes to be more comfortable, and so the original charter fleet, if you like, that first started in Fiordland were small 52 metre or 52 foot vessels, or some of them were small. The original one, Miss Akara, she was only 38 foot or 40 foot. But anyway, it's just as we want more comfort, therefore that's where the reasoning behind why these vessels have got larger, because people no longer want to be cramped and they want to have a shower and they want to have an ensuite and they all this. So that's what's adding to this bulk. But most of the areas, well, a lot of the areas in the southern fjords, there's more room to put for anchorages, for example. In the northern fjords, you're basically, if there's any sort of weather, which there generally is, you've got to be tucked in very close to shore in very small and sheltered coves. So the effect of, any incremental change in size is more noticeable. So I think it's just human nature. People have wanted more room, and that's why these boats have got bigger. And they're carting, I don't know necessarily say they're carting more people, but they're certainly wanting more space to have that luxury with it.
So it's mostly a visual impact. Just to clarify that we're concerned about with the increasing vessel size and that kind of scenario. It's definitely the visual impacts are the main concern. But there are also concerns around sort of increased light pollution from some of the larger vessels as well when they're on anchor at night. And then when it comes to the vessels that offer fishing, we're concerned about bigger vessels being able to accommodate more passengers and having an increasing impact on the fisheries sustainability in the Fiordland Marine area in general. And that sort of, unless you're considering marine biodiversity impacts, that might be beyond the scope of the sorts of effects that you're concerned about, but we certainly are.
Yeah, and also, Ed, sorry, I might have misheard that question, but certainly one of those, the impacts of these larger vessels, they're running generators, a lot of them, 24 hours a day. So at night, it's not just the light pollution or, you can hear the generators on these vessels running at night. So, and confined anchorages, and even not confined anchorages, Precipice Cove is a good example, and Bradshaw and the Doubtful Complex is that, you can hear one of the vessels there when you're parked up, hundreds of meters away. That's so there's all these combined effects coming from these vessels.
Well, thank you for that. Another question for Dr. McLeod. The effect on the dolphin population is something that pops up in many of the submissions. And you've mentioned that there are actual effects. Now, I haven't seen a study that shows the actual, there's certainly mentioned the potential effects, but is there any study of the dolphin, I think there's 3 populations along the coast there, or 3 families, that there is actual effect? Something to have a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think here we need to take into account the broader field of research of marine mammal disturbance from vessels and tourism that extends beyond Fiordland, because there are many studies around other parts of the country and around the world where they show that that when a marine mammal is in the presence of a vessel, it can often shift its behaviour from what it was doing to what it wants to do in regards to the vessel, whether that's play with the vessel's wake or whether it is to stop feeding or to move away from its area, to come out of a resting state and swim away. And all of those sorts of things mess with the natural mode of operation of that marine mammal. And ultimately, if they're getting disturbed a lot, can result in really detrimental effects to their body condition in terms of weight loss, because they're not spending enough time resting and feeding. Or again, it can affect their fecundity and calf survivorship as well in really extreme situations. So it's not just about vessel strike, which is another risk of vessels and marine mammals interacting, but it's more about these kind of wider health concerns. And I don't think there's been any direct studies of that in the Fiordland Marine area, although they have done a lot of work looking at the behaviour of the dolphins and which parts of the fjords they utilise, particularly in Doubtful Sound Patea, but down those sorts of studies are beginning with a shorter history in Breaksea Tamatea. But certainly up in Te Piwharangi, up in the Bay of Islands, they've just recently put a marine mammal sanctuary in place, and the scientific evidence that informed that management decision was all about the detrimental impacts of vessel disturbance on the health of marine mammals that frequent that area. So there is a wide body of research, and I'd be happy to provide some papers. I don't have them on me at the moment, obviously, but if that was something you're interested in considering, I could pull a collection of papers together to support those statements.
Well, that would be helpful. You're going to give us a written copy of your submission. If you could flip onto those studies that come out in films, it would be useful.
I think, sorry, a lot of those studies are referred to by Mr. Rebel, and we haven't actually asked any questions of Mr. Rebel or looked into, but he's provided a very extensive reference list at the back of his statement, Dr. McLeod, which might cross over with some of the ones you're talking about. I think the Bay of Islands, excuse me, I think, excuse me, the Bay of Islands study that you refer to actually goes so far as to say displacement, I think, of those populations from within, the confined areas of the Bay of Islands.
Yeah,
So that's certainly helpful to provide us. Certainly.
You referred to the earlier in your submission about the effects of pest control activities. I inference that was a negative effect.
Yeah, we had are we allowed to talk about specific matters, specific consent applications? Is that?
Yes, I mean if it's demonstrating or supporting what you're saying, there's no problem with it at all. No.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So this wasn't a surface water activity consent, but relevant context. A couple of years ago, there was an application by the Alpine Group Limited to land helicopters in a flight restricted area called Muscat Bay, up north of Milford Sound, Piatahi. And the guise was that they were going, needing to land on this restricted area in order to conduct pest control activities for the Department of Conservation. And the Department of Conservation had a trap line that had something on the order of less than 10 DOC 200 traps, and the Alpine Group were contracted to go and land at the beach and conduct sort of maintenance work on these traps, like clearing and checking and resetting the traps. And so the applicant applied to Environment Southland for a consent to land the helicopter at that place based on their need to fulfill this agreement that they had with the Department of Conservation to do that trap work. But they applied for essentially an unlimited number of landings in that place to conduct this pest work, including, and I'm sorry if I've got the details slightly wrong, but it was something on order of like multiple landings per day and the ability to basically land there whenever they wanted throughout the year, in order to check these 8 traps and extend the line and add maybe double the number of traps in time. But we know that what they were doing was actually taking tourists along with them and providing this kind of exclusive experience where they could land on this beach. They could eat some crayfish, they were caught locally and have a beautiful feast on the beach, drink a bottle of bubbly and fly back home again. And it just seemed, we alerted Environment Southland to what was actually required from our perspective for them to fulfill that contract with the Department of Conservation, contrasted with what they were applying for from council. And over time, eventually, that consent got severely sort of restricted just so that it gave them enough, a little bit of contingency, but just enough to get that job done. But that's the risk that we see, and it's based on experience.
So just sorry, some quick context. That the area it was in was a wilderness area, so you couldn't land there. It was just north of Yates's Point, north side of Milford Sound. So this company had the ability to land where no one else did. And that it became farcical that they were having to do multi-day trips to effectively go and I think it was less than 15 traps, whatever it was, to service them. I mean, it was just, but that's our concern about the guise of conservation can be used to facilitate commercial operation.
Thank you for your answer.
If I may, Councillor Cook, just thinking a little bit more about the question you asked about the marine mammals. I'm not sure if you're aware about the Marine Mammal Code of Conduct that exists in Doubtful Sound Patea at the moment, which establishes those dolphin protection zones throughout the fjord complex. But this is a voluntary code that's managed by the Department of Conservation that the charter vessel, the tourist vessel fleet are signatories to. And it essentially is based upon the acknowledgement that vessel interactions with marine mammals can have negative consequences for their health and their breeding and their overall population size. And so the management measure that was brought in to try and reduce those impacts was the establishment of these dolphin protection zones, where if that operators have very restricted rules around how they can access and operate in those zones that are of important use to the dolphins, whether they're important feeding grounds or resting grounds or whatever. So actually that whole process that went through was probably 10 years ago when the Marine Mammal Code of Conduct was established, was all based on the acknowledgement that vessels interacting with marine mammals has negative outcomes for marine mammals. So regardless of whether or not there are more studies in play, there was enough evidence back in those days for that management procedure to be put in place and supported by the Department of Conservation, the Guardians and tourist operators.
Well, I wasn't in denial. It's common sense to accept that there will be some effects on the dolphin population, and we're trying to measure what level of activity is unacceptable in these sounds. So that's what I'm asking questions about.
No, thank you. And I guess when that Marine Mammal Code of Conduct was signed, the Doubtful Sound Patea was one of the busiest places. I mean, it still is, but since then we know more about this resident population in Dusky Sound, Tamatea, and that whole fjord complex. And we know that the number of vessels and vessel activity is increasing in that area as well. We also know that there are more and more diverse marine mammals that are frequenting that area. Recently, Hector's dolphins have been sighted in the Field and Marine area, blue whales, southern right whales. It's a really important area for marine mammals in general. And we're currently having conversations around the Guardians table about whether we need to be more proactive in terms of providing more protection for marine mammals in advance of those vessel activities and increasing in there, so that we can sort of be the fence at the top of the cliff, not the ambulance at the bottom.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just another couple, in terms of your comments, I didn't catch the policy now, but we discussed it yesterday, that uses the generally free that you spoke to. I asked Ms. Robertson yesterday whether a way around using that very loose term generally free would be to name the exceptions where there are structures, so to name Deep Cove and Doubtful Sound and perhaps Kisby as the three areas, and then avoid that word generally.
I'd support that.
In policy 16.2.3, at the moment, uses the word or, so avoid or mitigate adverse effects on marine mammals. And I asked Ms. Robertson whether that would be better to be an and, being that the duty is to avoid. I just wondered what your view on that was.
Yeah, great.
Seems good to me.
In policy 16.2.15, which is about the short duration consent terms, I think I heard you say, Dr. McLeod, that this is not in scope of PC5. I just wondered if you could tell us why it's not in scope.
I guess it comes down, we assumed it wasn't in the scope of PC5, given that this is a temporary sort of holding the line measure, and that it would be something that would be fully assessed more adequately in the process of the review of the coastal plan. But we do think, sorry, I'll leave it there.
So yesterday I explored that a little more with Mr. Panga from Tami or Ngāi Tahu. And I just explored whether or not, I think this, as it is written, applies to all consents going forward. But I explored whether there need to be a shorter term consent for any new consents that may be issued under PC5's provisions. So if somebody did get a consent through the non-complying activity status, then whether a short duration is in 5 or 10 years would be the appropriate duration. So sort of not throwing out the bathwater with the baby and getting rid of this whole policy, but maybe having a sharper one directed at those that are caught by this change.
Would that also, would that in your mind also extend to consents that are being renewed during the
And then that's where the discussion went from there, and that's how it sort of split out as to whether, because basically the Runanga are supporting a shorter duration, so I wanted to understand what shorter meant and whether it applied to both existing and new. And I think he answered in the end that it would be both.
Yes,
Sorry.
No, I interrupted you. We've discussed as a 10-year consent term for surface water consents, and the reason for that is that if you are allowing for longer term consents, and the coastal plan gets reviewed and the baseline shifts, and the carrying capacity, is found to be lower than what it currently is, it allows the adaptive management. Otherwise, by providing for longer consents, you're essentially cementing in the existing baseline, which we would disagree with. So it allows for adaptive management. So we'd be supportive of a shorter consent term. And I think 10 years would be reasonable, even for those renewing. I mean, we tend to support longer consent terms for fixed structures like moorings and wharves and things like that. But when it comes to these transient activities, given the changing nature of demand in tourism in New Zealand, shorter consent terms make sense to us.
So if there was no scope within the submissions to put in a policy along the lines of, setting a shorter term for any consents that might get through PC5, is it your preference that policy 16.2.15 should just be removed and dealt with through the wider review?
It probably needs to be dealt with in both cases. I mean, I think we'd support if it could be a short consent term in the PC5, but then we do think that the consent term probably needs reviewing again under the coastal plan review. Do you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, look, I think a good example is that, when the Fiord and Marine Management Act came in 2005, we did major changes then that we thought would safeguard that environment, for the coming 20, 30 years. Will that prove not to be correct in part? So for the long way of saying, yes, we do support a shorter consent term because it's changed so much in the last 10 years. So it's hard to even try and understand what it might be like in the next 10 years. So absolutely, that's enough said. We do support a shorter term.
So some of the evidence we've heard is that this is a knee-jerk reaction to a blip from COVID. And I pick up from you that you would disagree with that you've seen an intensification, just following on from what you've just said, Mr. Paget, over the last couple of decades. I'm just interested in your view on that.
Yeah, this is absolutely, COVID has shown why it's no longer tenable to carry on the way we're going. I mean, under the current plan, there is no reason, there's no grounds for denying further applications, and that's why we're sitting here today. So this is not about COVID. COVID has just been demonstrated why the current plan, as we all know, is no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah, we definitely noticed a increase in activity in terms of resource consents being issued well before COVID came along. Yeah, and since this plan change got notified, we all of a sudden we've got a lot more spare time to focus on other things. Not spare time to focus on other things, because while we were busy assessing resource consent applications, yeah, over the last 5 years or so, it has been a major part of our workload, and has been really noticeable at the drop off over the last year.
So obviously we're not looking at recreational use, and we're not looking at cruise ships. Those are both outside of the scope of PC5. And accepting that, my question really is about that we've heard a lot of evidence about the increasing activity and cumulative effects from recreational use, and how people are going further in more vessels. Would you agree with that there's been a large contribution of effects attributable to the increase in recreational vessels?
Yeah, yes, we've noticed an increase in recreational visitors to the area. Obviously, those that are chasing the big pelagic fish, there's been this, pretty well publicised increase in trailer boats entering Milford Sound, Piopiotahi, and also into Doubtful Sound, Patea. But as vessels get bigger, people can make their own way into the more remote parts of Fiordland, so people are going further. We're not about shutting down Fiordland and restricting access, and our vision is very much about people being able to use and enjoy this area. We appreciate that the coastal plan doesn't currently manage for recreational users or restrict or encompass them under the rules, but we need to make sure that we leave space for them, because they have just as much right to go in there and enjoy this part of New Zealand and have a safe experience and be able to seek safe haven in there and have those same values that we're all hoping for Fiordland as well.
Yeah, and can I just add that, this is not just about people getting on a surface water consent vessel or a private vessel. It's what the council's role, as well as the Fiordland Marine Guardians, what it was set up to do, is this is about managing the human impact on that environment. And so people that are going in there on these vessels have had a serious impact on the fish populations in the fjords. That is a big part of what kicked this off. So, it's the more people that go in there, the greater the impact on the environment. The bigger the vessels, the more impact they have in the anchorages and that environment. So this is just about trying to manage the human impact on this really special part of New Zealand. It's just, we can't allow this to be degraded. All of us have got a responsibility, and I'd argue that the surface water consent holders, the value of their business is actually about looking after this more than we want to try and do it. That would be at the forefront of my mind if I had a surface water consent, because that's what the value is for them.
Well, thank you very much. My last question is really just an opportunistic one, and I should have asked other people yesterday. And it may well be something that we seek the views of others, but I'll get yours while we're here anyway. We have been offered, or a real NZ said that they would like us to take a site visit, and we initially thought that a site visit really to Deep Cove or Milford Sound wouldn't really help inform our decision. It was really just a snapshot in time. And then yesterday, Mr. Norris helpfully explained that what they were offering was potentially to fly us into Supper Cove and spend a couple of days while there was some conservation work being done in Dusky, so it would be a reasonable sort of tiki tour of Dusky, and then come back round and come out through Deep Cove, so it would be a sort of four-day trip. We sort of discussed that last night, and our initial view is we don't want to do that unless there's some value in it. We certainly don't want to hold up the time excuse me, of the plan change. Excuse me. We're all quite aware that we've got quite a lot of experience in Fiordland and that we've seen these areas. But one thing that I reflected on overnight, discussing it as a panel, was my perceptions are probably 20 years old now. And I keep hearing things from people about how much has changed in the last 10 years, 20 years, and those things. And some of the other panel members, perceptions or experiences are probably of a similar historic nature. So my question really to you both is whether you see value in the panel doing something like that, or whether that's something you just say for the wider review.
Look, thanks for asking. I think that if you've already got a good working knowledge of Fiordland and you've visited it, I don't see what value you would get from going in there in the dead of winter. It's not the busy time. You would go in there and you'd probably experience quite a quiet Fiordland and come away wondering what all the fuss is about. If this was February, absolutely, that would have been a really good idea, but I don't see what that would add going in July. But what do you think, Mark?
Look, to me, go for your life if you want to, but it's what are you measuring here? This is a moment in time. That is all you're seeing for 4 days. What may or may not happen in that 4 days? How does that give an understanding of what our concerns are about this increasing usage and number of surface water consents and the latent effort that's still sitting there? How about managing that into the future? It's no, I don't see any value in that whatsoever.
Right. Well, we're interested in everyone's views before we make our final decision on to or not. So thank you very much for all the efforts you put in, obviously, to your submission and for coming and speaking to us today. And we certainly do appreciate from the side of the table that you have a very big role to play, and these are just one of the hats that you wear in your busy lives. So thank you for your efforts.
No, you're welcome, no problem, and thank you for the support of council and for kicking this all off in the first place. I've got some tasks, some actions. I need to send these notes through and see if I can find some papers as well. But I am very busy for the rest of today, so it may be tomorrow until I get to that. I hope.
Now,
that's
Dr. McLeod, just to make sure that you don't have to go off and spend a lot of effort, I suggest that you start with Mr. Rebel's statement. And at the moment, nobody is challenging that statement. That evidence remains tabled and unchallenged, and obviously is likely to be accepted by this panel. And then on top of that, we had Mr. Kinsey here yesterday, who also verbally said he supported Mr. Rebel's report and also emphasised some of the research that is available showing the adverse effects of surface water activities or vessels on dolphins. And he's not providing us anything else in writing, but I guess I'm alluding to if you wanted to just review that and support rather than giving us another reiteration.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My list is pretty full, so that's good.
I think it was a really good question, and I think your response could perhaps be along those lines.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Stuart Hall was on the list, but Stuart Hall was unfortunately not able to attend today. So that brings us to the end of hearing from submitters, which brings us back to you. Are you in a position to respond to anything verbally, or would you prefer just to take some time and provide a written response?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think just I would like to provide a written reply. But generally I would say that recommendations have been included to AC, but I will do some minor changes to those as a result of hearing the evidence. And also I would let Mr. Rebel as well to respond to some of the questions raised in real consent evidence. So I think you might be able to reply as well.
My question for him is, excuse me, it's similar line to Nice to have lost the point. Along a similar line to councillor Cook, really, it was going to be asking of his very large reference list. It's hard to tell where some of those studies were carried out, whether they were Fiordland based, Islands based. So it might be helpful just for him to elaborate a bit more about some of those that are local. And then I think the Bay of Islands is a very interesting area to look at, because the research up there has taken it really to the next level and shown displacement through noise and activity of the dolphin population. So there is a tipping point there where no longer does it become just disturbance, it actually becomes displacement. So it might be helpful for them to give us a little bit more there. That was really based on my question.
I just said, the University of Otago have been doing studies on dolphins down there for many years.
Yes.
Like Meridian consent, which is different thing was going to be. And we were quite extensive data given to that population. So I'm assuming that's been ongoing. So I'm just looking for data specific to Fiordland. If there's any.
If I will ask Mr. Robel to respond to the question. Generally speaking, I think the recommendations as to whether yeah, we will consider those questions. Anything else that is contact might result in one changes to.
Okay. In terms of views on site with it, I think unfortunately we had the opportunity to actually check when she's out. Is that something that you would like to come back to us, or do you have an initial view, both of you?
If we might discuss, but if there was actually a time frame, I mean obviously ASAP. But...
Yes, well, I was going to ask what kind of time frame you were looking at for your article comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to see some of the other responses prior to doing the right to reply. So questions were asked of Mr. 10 minutes regarding the definition of limits and on there. So I would be keen to see the responses from the prior to the final.
So if we were to issue a minute along the lines of giving a time frame for any additional information that's been asked, if it's not provided by that, it just won't be in the minutes, giving everybody a target, perhaps maybe 10 working days following the hearing for submitters to get these minor matters in. And then we set a time frame for the right reply. What time frame we should be looking at?
Possibly just 15 minutes or something. The break.
That's what we'll do. We will do I'm just very conscious that 10 working days in this environment we live in now, where if somebody gets sick and they're out of the office for 5 working days, we even can be put on time. So perhaps we allow 15 working days for your right of reply, which just puts a little bit of contingency in there for you to consult with anybody else that we need to internally. And from that point, we will receive the right of reply and you know, in terms of getting the parties know closing, when we closing the hearing. Obviously, there is no particular time frame like there is for consent for us to get the decision out. But this side of the table, I think, is very anxious to move as quickly as we possibly can, knowing that this is an interim measure that's going to be into the review. So we will try and do it as fast as we possibly can. And hopefully, if everybody's available, not, you know, years time, like some decisions still being made. So, does it sound okay? Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. Well, unless anybody's got anything else in terms of or anything of that process sounds I do wonder whether, whether we should hear from. When I put in that minute on that first deadline, if anybody's got any comments to make in terms of the scientists and the value of that, because I think we really are interested in what the participants in the hearing, actually what their views are in terms of the value for us. So perhaps I'll add that into our minutes. We could just seek that feedback for that date, to sort of maximise things.
Is the change we copy of what's on that?
Yes, so what we'll do is the Field and Marine Guardians will provide that to Ms. Onka, and then she will forward that to all of the parties so that everybody's got all of the information. And the same with the minutes and anything else that comes in, that'll all be forwarded to you as well, to your email or your contact address. Okay, well, that's everything we would do. I'd really like to thank the staff for your organisation in the hearing. It's obviously gone very smoothly, and you never know how many people are going to be in the gallery and how many people want to be heard. So thank you very much for organising all of that. It's all run very smoothly, so thank you. And I think we'll just end with kind of here, and I wonder if there's would you like to do this? Kia ora. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Kora no whanau. Ngā mihi, o ngā mihi o te wā, mei te whanau o Irarangi, ngā mihi ki te kawaihi, o Awhike te Peno, and kia ora no ngā manawiri me ngā kōrero. Ngā mihi ki te kapukahari me ngā kato. No reira, ana nei te kaikaik, hare o maru, karakia. When you hear, and I hear ki te uru, ki panui, ki a wātia, ki a māma, e te tinana, te nako, te waro, i te ara takata koe ara, e wangu pakaarea ake ki runga ki a tina, uye, tai, ki ora sekura, saimi ki ori.
Oh, Mr. Dosby, because it's listening in.
You see, it's just.